All righty, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to welcome you all to our latest fireside chat in the series of webinars we've been bringing to everyone. We are really happy to be able to bring this series of informational chats to all of you to help through the challenging times we're all experiencing, but also to bring some knowledge to everyone in the cannabis industry. I'm Frank Niesenbaum, VP of Sales for C2B Tech, and I'll be your host today. I'm also really excited to be joined by Jim McCoy, the Director of Operations and Managing Partner of Verde Compliance Partners, one of our partners in this industry. And Jim will be sharing his experience with the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and also the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau to help us understand the current and future legislation around the cannabis industry. And even in these tough times and challenging times, which has actually been even worse lately, we know many of you, especially in the cannabis industry, are still doing business and will value the information that we can bring you today, or those that are just getting into the cannabis industry. So again, welcome, Jim. Nice to see you.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for letting me come on your talk today. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. And today's chat, like we said, we'll be focusing on the future, especially the future of federal legislation in the cannabis industry. I know that's something that is on a lot of people's mind that are already in the industry or thinking about getting into it. So before we begin, we always like to start with a couple of poll questions. The first one being a little generic, but asking whether you are open for business. Just to get a gauge, and yes, you are fully operational. Maybe you're some with some modification, some remote employees are working from home, that type of thing, or no, you're not open for business right now. We'll give you a few seconds here to answer. Okay, well, looks like a little bit of a mix. Mostly in business, though, fully operational, which is very good. So that was the first question. The second, we'd like to, just as we talk about legislation, gauge to see, if you operate in more than one state, yes or no. Okay, I think that's good. That's helpful. Looks like a pretty evenly split there in terms of some yes, some no. Makes total sense. So again, that's helpful information, and we appreciate the responses, and we're going to get started. So Jim, my first question, I have to say, your experience and background is really fascinating to me, and I'm curious as to what you feel are the similarities between the repeal of alcohol prohibition and legalization, and now what's going on with the legalization of cannabis.
Well, there's some interesting similarities between the two. If you go back to 1933 with a constitutional amendment that ended alcohol prohibition, of course, the federal government had to engage in lawmaking to implement that constitutional amendment change. The way they rolled it out was with the Federal Alcohol Administration Act in 1935, which provided for permits and label and formula controls, which those are still in place today, the same law. And the existing controls over industrial alcohol were extended to the new beverage industry with bonds, permits, taxes, registrations. And up until 1980, there was on-site supervision with plant officers on site. As we look at the cannabis prohibition ending, which you're going to see, it's not been under constitutional amendment. It's going to be legislation which will deschedule cannabis and allow it to be a legal product under a very tight regulatory pattern similar to alcohol and tobacco, which I know most of the folks operating in the legal states know that their state has, in most cases or nearly all cases, have used their alcohol and tobacco structure to regulate. And the federal government, and with recent contacts with their management at TTB, was that just simply, they're not going to reinvent the wheel to do this. should be a known territory for them, and that's a good thing in respect to how the industry will be looked at. They tend to take each new industry as a new toy, though, so it should be interesting. But I think it should be a lot of similarities. One interesting factor is the closeness of the cannabis legislation, and the inclusion of the most advanced bill is the criminal reform or justice reform provisions, which are basically to wipe out a lot of past convictions and set up trust funds, various things that are in the legislation which go beyond just simply regulating the industry. But they will also provide a link from the past industry, which technically has been illegal under federal law, and bridge the current legal state industry over to be legal under federal law. So we're going to see exactly how that language plays out. It's different in some of the bills. So that's an aspect that should be of interest to make sure that folks in the industry today are able to cross the bridge into the federal permit system. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons, one thing we like to, we'll be working with folks on. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And government is government, right? So there's going to be all kinds of new things coming out. And I guess from that perspective, I know I hear a lot of talk from some of the legal people in the industry and others that I've been in contact with, that there are some things going on. And so I'm just curious, maybe you can expound or tell us a little bit about what the current status is of the federal legislation that we know is going on, or the legalization. Something's in the works.
Well, it's been said that there's approximately 100 and some bills have been introduced in the last couple of years. It's wow. A very active area. The two that I would focus on is one is HR 3884, which is a companion in the Senate, as well as the HR 1120. The first one establishes, essentially, if you look at the exact language of it, it takes and makes cannabis a line item in the tobacco tax law, and the same permits apply. So you'd be just another tobacco manufacturer, which will change the name to include marijuana products or cannabis products. And the two bills actually use the two terms. One uses cannabis, one uses marijuana. So they got to decide what they're doing. The other law essentially creates an interesting structure with requiring wholesale permits and such under the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, which is the same law, as I said, going back to the 30s, but also establishes a new Title 56 for marijuana taxes and manufacturing regulations. So one way or the other, we're going to have a structure to work with whenever it's passed. I would almost think that this first one I mentioned, the HR 3884, which is called the MORE Act, it is most of the language in the act is on the criminal justice reform, and the tax law is a short segment, just simply, like I said, makes it another tobacco product. So that's kind of an interesting approach to it.
Yeah, that makes it very simple.
Yep.
Well, go right ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, no, and the other bill that's actually passed the House is a banking legislation to help the industry, enable them to use the banking industry fully. I'm not sure exactly the provisions of that, but it would be a companion to legalization, which really might not be necessary, except for the fact that the federal law should provide, because of source of funding, et cetera, for under these permits, to legalize the past and existing financial structures of the businesses, to sort of step back and reach back and legitimize where the money came from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So multiple bills or legislation in process, and something to come along. So I guess with that in process, I know how the government works. You know how the government works. You work for the government, so you know it very well. So if it does, I guess when it does, passes Congress. So how much time do you think that the people out here, the people in the audience, would have to apply for a permit and be able to get there?
Well, basing it on the experience I had being inside of TTB back when the tobacco law was changed in 2009, Normally what they do is they have to do a pretty quick temporary rulemaking to get things started. There's a lot of things involving changes of forms, etc. But one of the statutes, the number one I was talking about, has a 1-year implementation where from the date of its passage, then it will be implemented 1 year after that. So for example, if it's passed in early next year, it would be right around the first part of 21 that we would look at the tax and permit structure. And the way it's projected to work is that somebody who's a current state licensee would be able to keep operating while their federal permit is pending, but they'll have to get that permit application in within the application window for it to be considered even as a rollover or transitional permit. Anybody new in the business would be from scratch, and they would probably come last in the processing. But as long as the application is filed, problem will be the number of people applying. And as a small agency, it's going to be quite a scramble to see how long it takes to get a permit.
Yeah, that's you're right. There's going to be quite a few. It's going to be a large number, so it makes a lot of sense. So when they look at their business, or if I'm one of these companies out there and I want to do it, what can I do, or what do I need to do, or how can I prepare for the legislation that's coming? I mean, what should I be thinking about and doing now?
Well, first of all, you kind of pay attention to the changes and be ready for it. There's some things you can do ahead of time is to make sure your ducks in a row, your organization is properly registered with the state, your state license is current, that any filings with the state as to changes in officers, directors, stock, all the little things that businesses have to do to keep perfectly up to date, organized, make sure that's all done. And then when you're looking at the federal permit, we already know what documentation is going to be required pretty much. There'll be some tweaks to it, I guess, for this particular industry. But they're going to want all your organizational documents, articles of organization, officers, directors, who has signing authority for the company, where did the funding come from, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the typical things for distilleries, breweries, wineries, tobacco manufacturers. And also look at the premises, be able to describe in detail the premises, equipment, and security provisions. And I suspect with this industry, security provisions will be high. The two bills have different tax structures. The tobacco bill basically calls for a 5% of the first sale. So if you sell something for $100, that's $5 tax. It's a percent of sales price tax. And then the other legislation has a graduated tax that's low the first 2 years, but increases up to 25% after 5 years, which is pretty stiff. I mean, I don't know what the government's expecting. I know they're going to need a lot of revenue. We all know that. So we just have to see which one of these eagles flies here on these bills. You should be just simply also, one particular point I should make is the people involved in the business. You think of, okay, the government's going to probably wipe out certain types of backgrounds, and everybody's in a legal business. The states have already screened everybody, but to make sure that they fit in the federal requirements for the background of individuals involved with the businesses, and that means stockholders, officers, directors, anybody of significance with the company. Until we get final legislation, we won't know exactly the bottom line of that. But in general, if you look at the alcohol and tobacco rules, they're looking to make sure that, just as they did when prohibition ended in alcohol, they're making sure that the people coming into the new legal business are regular business people that want to do business in a compliant way. So if you're compliant, you're going to be able to move forward fairly straightforward with no problems. So just due diligence on making sure your organizations are ready to roll under federal guidance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you kind of touched on the things that they're going to need in terms of the people and the backgrounds. I can't imagine that the federal government's going to be easier from a licensure perspective or from a background check than regulation. I've got to believe it'll be more. It's the federal government, right? It's probably pretty straightforward. So when we talk about, you explained it well, there's a lot going on with legislation, what we can do to prepare. when it comes time, excuse me, who do you think, who will need to get a federal permit when cannabis is legalized? So we know what you have to do at the state level, but who's going to need that federal license when we get there? Will it be these same people?
Well, these bills are pretty consistent. There'll be anybody who's a cultivator. That means if you're growing the plants, whether indoors, outdoors, anybody who processes the plants, and that means converting them to a raw material state, as well as making it into finished packaged products, whether it's a food product or a smoking product or whatever. So anybody in that realm would need a permit. For example, in tobacco, you think of only tobacco finished products, but also they have permits for people who process tobacco. That's somebody who, which is since 2009, they simply receive bulk tobacco and they age it, store it, process it in any way. Had some pretty interesting things come up when we were working with that, but also papers and tubes manufacturers. So even today, somebody who's getting papers to use in for people to buy for cigarettes as well as for other cigarettes would be paying the federal tax on papers and tubes. So this is like coming into an area that we already know, and so we're able to translate that to this industry with some pre-knowledge. It's not going to be totally uniquely new in the regulatory structure. To be able to get a permit, what people are going to need, like I mentioned, organizational documents, everything about the company. They need to know who to contact with the company. And then another aspect of it will be that once you get your permit, you're like the dog that catches a car. Okay, now how am I going to create a record system that follows the federal guidance, which will be very specific? There'll be monthly reports. It'll be just another column on the tobacco report if that goes through. You get into documentation for if we get into exports of products. How do you pay your taxes? When do you pay your taxes? So it's the same issue that other permittees going into these regulated industries have to deal with. So yeah, those are the things to think about going forward, getting the permit and what you need to get the permit.
That makes a lot of sense. That's good information. I want to just quickly, just for a second, there was a question someone asked because you were talking about cannabis being, designated as a tobacco, getting a tobacco designation, kind of similar to that. The question was, does that apply to the, cannabinoid extracted CBD distillate? So, tobacco is not a product, what was asked, with medicinal application like CBD kind of has. Right. Do you think that will fit in there as well?
Well, that's one of the interesting angles of it by placing it in that tobacco realm, and I've thought that through quite a bit. It does provide, each of these laws provides an exemption for what we know as a CBD products. Essential oils are made from with a extremely low THC content, right, below 0.3. They will still be a non-taxed product, and it's a matter of, okay, whenever you have a product that's not taxed, an exemption in the law, then that way the government will normally have a registration or reporting structure of some kind to account for that. We don't know exactly what, but there is in each of these laws an exemption for certain materials and products made for medicinal use, and it's just for prescription drugs in that one law. So it would not be a non-prescription, but the CBD being the low THC content product is tax exempt under each of these statutes. Okay, that go through.
Great. Well, that hopefully answered the question. So kind of talking about what will be going on with permits. So what are the differences between getting a state permit and a federal permit, which obviously anybody in the business already has state permits?
Well, the good news is the states have been pretty strong in going through the requirements. Some of them have been very strict as to who gets a permit and who doesn't. I know here in Ohio they're talking about, my understanding was it was competitive actually for permits. And the federal government doesn't have any of that. If you qualify, you qualify. If you don't, you don't. So the state requirements focus, they included retail operations and sales regulations similar to like liquor retailers. Federal government has a very light touch in the retail area, only requiring registration of the businesses, which these proposed laws do not require registration of marijuana retailers. But at the wholesale level, we've got one law says they need a permit. The other law does not require a permit. So it's just a matter of the extent of the federal umbrella for permits. Currently, in the one law I was talking about, the tobacco treatment, it's a manufacturer permit, which covers cultivation to first sale. And then you have a permit for importing the products or for exporting the products. And so those are the three types that are currently, I see, in the proposed legislation.
Okay, that's helpful. And then, so what happens if we're denied that federal permit? What's our recourse?
Well, the federal permit regulations are in place. Their process, if you apply for a permit with the federal government, they're obligated to give you appropriate notice of a contemplated denial or the reasons why. And you have a right to a hearing. You have a right to be seen in front of an administrative law judge. It's a very formal process in that you do have rights of appeal on up to including federal district court. So everybody's got, the right to a fair hearing on any denial. It's pretty rare for somebody to be denied a permit. You have to have a pretty tough situation. What I've seen in alcohol is where somebody involved with a permit has say the vice president of the company has a record that the government says, well, they've got a tax fraud record and we're not going to allow them to be with this company. Well, the company then has to work that out and see if they can place that person on salary or not have that person there. So those are the kind of things that you might run into for denial. The worst thing is any material misstatements or false statements during the application process. It should be totally upfront, above board, exactly what's going on, no hidden ownership, nothing like that. It's got to be very truthful, and that's the number one way you can get a permit denied or forced withdrawal. So that's
good. Good stuff. I mean, it makes sense. I believe there's some recourse as well in there. So when we talk about, federal regulation, things like that, I know that, at the federal level, because it's not just one state, obviously, there's interstate ramifications. What's the effect of the federal legalization have on interstate commerce, which I know is a concern today, just when people are state to state having the license in more than one state?
Well, here, like in this industry, as I understand it, most of it is restricted to the state you're located in. And interstate commerce is not permitted. Under the federal law, you will, that I'm pretty certain that will open it up to the interstate commerce rules will all come into play, transportation and sales, all the typical issues. Interstate shipment, like between manufacturers, if somebody's shipping bulk product to another manufacturer, there'd be records of that under the federal rules, and each state would be able to regulate at each end of that. Just like in alcohol, you have a lot of states regulate, they'll register out-of-state producers or shippers. In this respect, what you'll see too is each of these legislations allow a state is not forced to allow cannabis. If you have a state that just simply says, we are not having it, and they keep it illegal, the federal rule will not allow the federal government to approve a permit if the state is not allowing it. The federal government can't overrule a state's authority on that. Same with alcohol. But there's a lot of case law going back on interstate commerce where a state cannot withhold interstate commerce that's not stopping in their state. For example, you have a truckload of product crossing a state where it's treated as illegal and it's an interstate shipment. That state, as long as that shipment is handled within certain regulatory guidelines, they literally normally can't stop it. That gets to be a lot of history and complex case law involved in those type of things.
Yeah, I have no doubt it's complex.
Yeah.
And so with that, so will we need a separate permit for every location, every state, et cetera, with the government?
Yeah, the federal government, for example, if you've got 6 growing facilities and a processing plant, each of those facilities would have a separate permit in general. The only exception that may be possible is the federal guidance is that you might have what's called a non-contiguous premise. Let's say your grow facilities are on the edge of town, and they're within 2 miles of the production facility. They may allow that under one permit. It just depends on the federal guidance at the time. I know with distilleries, we get that with typically like a barrel warehouse where you're storing whiskey and it's a couple miles away from your plant. We just put that under the same permit and bond. So there's a little bit of flexibility, but their guidance is in general about 10 miles and with very few exceptions. And usually it only can be like an auxiliary storage facility or something like that. So
well, that's good.
I would expect those
That's
rules to continue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of this is there, and so you've added a lot. I mean, obviously your knowledge about the industry, but as you know, your previous experience all applies to that. I guess the question I would pose here as we kind of wrap up, I know we're coming to the bottom of the hour or the half hour, just some final thoughts from your perspective on the legalities as it applies to the cannabis industry in general and what's going on at the federal level. I think your experience is valuable. Anything there that you can think of?
Well, in general, you can see, I mean, you go back to 20 years ago, you wouldn't even think you'd be at this point, 20,
Right.
25 years ago. But what you're seeing is a very similar structure to the situation you had. You went back to the end of Prohibition in 1933. You had a great transition. The country was in an economic depression,
Right.
the worst on record, which we hope we aren't headed for in this mess.
Right.
But I think we'll recover pretty good here, but because we had a good baseline for it. But just the mood of the country and the acceptance of the change. The alcohol prohibition turned out to be a disastrous 14-year experiment in product control, where with a prohibition created criminals, and that's what you do when you have an unreasonable prohibition. And that's what I think a lot of people now are viewing cannabis as having been a 70 years of a pretty much a unnecessary prohibition is what a lot of people look at it like. Yeah. And also as we've grown with the number of things you can do, that the beneficial side of the drug is that it actually, so a lot of people swear by its positive impact. Between the CBD as the essential oils become more popular and people are getting benefit, they're seeing that as another oil that's very helpful. And the calmative properties, there's a lot out there about the product and a lot of positive it can do. And some people look at it as, well, it's probably a better than a tobacco, which has such a proven consequences to its use. And anytime you have a product of this nature, which can be mind or physically altering to humans, you got to be careful with its use, but if you look at cultures all over the world, they have their own products they like to use. In the tobacco world, we deal with that a lot. So
yeah. That makes sense. Jim, I want to thank you. This was an insightful conversation. Your experience and knowledge is very helpful. Hopefully, hopefully there was good information for those of you that attended. We look forward to you joining us the next one, as a partner with Verity. And if there are questions or things, we can help get you in touch with Jim and his team. If you're looking for help with the systems and accounting things that you need to track your business, we're here to help you at C2B. We do have another webinar coming up on June 18th about how to avoid some of the common federal compliance pitfalls. I can't wait for that one. We've talked about federal legislation. Now we'll talk about the federal pitfalls. June 18th, 2 p.m. You see the the registration there. Please go out, register, and we look forward to talking to you next in a couple of weeks. And I hope everybody stays safe and takes careful. And Jim, we will catch up with you soon.
Thank you, Frank. Appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.